Designing any complex system requires navigating a razor-thin boundary. On one side is entropy, where structures break down into chaos. On the other is order, where components lock into rigid, predictable patterns. G.C. Myers captures this boundary in Between Order and Chaos. Above, a slashing, turbulent sky. Below, structured flower beds. Notice how the circular flower bed echoes the sun above. This is form recognizing form across scale, a terrestrial pattern reflecting a celestial one. Psychologist Carl Jung described this underlying unity as the Unus Mundus, the one world. Today, systems designers call it recursive fractal consistency, or RFC. It is the observation that highly stable, fundamental patterns repeat themselves regardless of the scale you are looking at. This visual echo provides a functional blueprint for engineering coherence, mapping artistic intuition to the way order emerges in both biological tissues and human social networks. For decades, connecting psychological intuition to the hard physical sciences was incredibly difficult. Noticing a meaningful coincidence or an archetype is easy. Proving the mechanical structure behind it is not. The first rigorous attempt to bridge that gap came from Jung's collaboration with Nobel-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli. They proposed a dual-aspect monism, the idea that mind and matter are just two complementary perspectives of the exact same underlying reality. The missing mechanical link between those two worlds is a concept known as state modulation. Instead of applying force to individual components, you alter the environment. By shifting the underlying operating state of the system, the nodes naturally self-organize into coherence. But to confirm that recursive fractal consistency is a structural reality and not just a poetic theory, we have to isolate this behavior. We need to observe state modulation driving emergence in a purely biological, non-cognitive environment. If the universe runs on fractal patterns, the mechanism aligning a flower bed to the sun must dictate how living cells repair a physical wound. We find that proof in developmental biology, specifically at Michael Levin's lab at Tufts University, which studies basal cognition and the collective intelligence of cells. We usually think of the genome as the ultimate blueprint of life, but Levin's research identifies a distinct, separate layer of control, bioelectricity. While DNA provides the hardware, cells use voltage differences to run software. These electrical patterns store the target anatomy, telling the collective tissue what shape to build. To test this theory, researchers created anthrobots. These are tiny, self-assembling biological robots constructed entirely from normal adult human tracheal cells. They require zero genetic modification. In 2023, the lab conducted a neural scratch experiment on a two-dimensional sheet of human neurons, dragged a metal rod through it to create a severe physical chasm, and then deployed anthrobots directly into the void. The experiment yielded a clear result. Within 72 hours, the anthrobots actively induced the severed neurons to regrow across the void, closing the gap completely. The anthrobots do not act as a physical scaffold, nor do they micromanage the neurons. Instead, they provide a localized communications pathway. They modulate the bioelectric voltage of the environment, which reactivates the neuron's innate repair protocols. At the cellular level, life heals ruptures not through top-down mechanical coercion, but through localized state modulation that guides emergence. We can map this exact biological mechanism directly onto human behavior using a framework called ROFA, or relational patterning, which is used to facilitate highly vulnerable groups experiencing trauma or housing insecurity. The structural isomorphism is one-to-one. A social rupture functions identically to the neural gap. When dysregulated, rational persuasion fails. Trying to heal a room by demanding compliance targets the intellect while ignoring the underlying electrical alarm bells ringing in the body. Here, the facilitator serves the exact same role as the anthrobot. They cannot force the system to heal. They can only modulate the group's collective state, using pacing, symbolic framing, and archetypes to create an environment where the social network can self-repair. This table details the practical probes used to achieve that shift. By deploying visual metaphors at the symbolic layer, a facilitator bypasses defensive resistance. They shift the room's operating state practically, which leads directly to testable behavior changes, like rapid de-escalation. This isomorphism suggests a shared principle of repair. Both cellular networks and human groups respond to the same intervention, modulating the underlying state to allow coherence to emerge. But this creates a profound paradox for anyone managing human systems. If state modulation successfully bypasses our rational defense mechanisms, it yields an immense amount of power. There is a very thin line between ethical, guided emergence and unethical, covert manipulation. When working with vulnerable populations, practitioners need rigid guardrails to ensure they are building agency rather than just extracting compliance. This diagnostic matrix outlines drift warnings for facilitators. Notice the primary flags: becoming attached to your metaphor or mistaking a quiet room for a healthy one. Silence is not regulation. A compliant room often masks deep dysregulation, indicating the group prioritizes obedience over authentic trust. This subsequent row in the matrix isolates an even deeper hazard: the tendency to use calming tools to suppress valid distress. A system cannot heal if its actual complaints regarding safety or material needs are ignored in favor of forced harmony. Without explicit, self-critical guardrails, a facilitator's natural drive for a smooth session degrades from state modulation into quiet authoritarian control. The ethical target for this kind of systems design is low authoritarian coherence. It is the ability to maintain stability and safety in a chaotic environment entirely without coercion. To maintain this, participants require an explicit Bill of Rights. They must retain the absolute right to challenge the facilitator's symbolic frame, to opt out of any exercise without penalty, and to demand plain language instead of metaphors. This final cell in the matrix warns against a critical structural failure. If the people with the least power in the room are doing the majority of the adapting, the system is not healing. It is just reproducing existing institutional pressure. When the framework fails, practitioners must rely on a quick reset protocol. You drop the symbols, you abandon the metaphors, and you return immediately to the concrete, material needs of the people in the room. Returning to G.C. Meyer's painting reveals the structural schematic beneath the aesthetic. The geometry holding steady beneath the storm maps the essential conditions for survival. To build a truly stable world, we have to stop trying to force the components to obey. Instead, we have to step into the chaos, modulate the state, and ethically engineer the conditions for order to emerge on its own.